photographic records of the relocation of Japanese Americans in the United States during World War II may seem remarkably happy and picturesque. However, the story behind those photos is truly heartbreaking. In today's video, we will tell you about the traumatic relocation to concentration camps of entire Japanese communities, carried out by Americans as a precaution after the Pearl Harbor attack. Welcome once again to Military History for this journey into the past. Let's begin. The roots of Japanese immigrant communities in the United States began with the massive migration of Japanese workers in 1885. Many traveled to the mainland United States, where they worked on railroads, sawmills, and canneries, while others migrated to the island of Hawaii, where they were employed on agricultural plantations, facing harsh working conditions. Soon after their arrival, Japanese Americans became the target of severe racial discrimination. The anti-Japanese movement was adopted by almost every sector of society, driven by local pressure, claiming that the Japanese were untrustworthy and came to steal jobs from American citizens. The ultimate goal was to force the Japanese to move as far away as possible, as recounted by the son of an immigrant.
One reason he left Caristone was that white workers of the mill tried to run the Japanese workers out of the area, made it very unpleasant for Japanese workers and Japanese families at that mill, threatened in various ways, and he remained insisting that he was not going to be run out by a bunch of rowdies. However, it was unpleasant enough, and therefore he finally moved out.
Much of the discrimination faced by Japanese immigrants was due to federal laws that denied Japanese and other Asian immigrants the opportunity to naturalize as American citizens. In 1913, California passed the first land law prohibiting aliens ineligible for citizenship from buying agricultural land. This essentially meant that the Japanese were second-class citizens, a regulation with clear racist undertones. The Japanese community attempted to defend itself. Since electoral politics were closed to the Japanese, they indirectly organized and funded various legal challenges against these laws, all of which were rejected by the Supreme Court in 1922 and 1923. Finally, in 1924, the federal government banned all Japanese immigration, leaving the Japanese community on American soil unprotected and virtually without rights. Despite the hostile environment, Japanese immigrants and their American-born children settled and built ethnic communities and institutions where agriculture was the main economic driver. Little Tokyos emerged in cities on the West Coast, and churches, newspapers, and youth political and social organizations proliferated. The challenges faced by the Japanese in the United States fostered a strong sense of nationalism in the community. At the same time, growing geopolitical and military tensions between Japan and the United States left many Japanese Americans in suspense, fearing the worst. This tension generated rampant racism, even against children. As remembered, still with pain, by a victim of this discrimination.
Had some horrendous experience or shocking experience. I would forget that we are racially different. It was hot, say, hey, let's go swimming, and the pool is right up here, the Crystal Pool. So I said, hey, that's a great idea. So we went there, and they paid, and I'm in line, and when it came to me, they said no. They didn't say, they just waved their hands, said out. And it just caught me by surprise. And the others, they were shocked. They didn't know, they couldn't understand it. I understood right away what it was about. And they start arguing with the cashier. And at the same time, I was already halfway down the block.
For almost a decade before the outbreak of war, several federal agencies had been surveilling Japanese American communities in anticipation of a possible war with Japan. The general consensus of these investigations was that they posed a threat to the United States in the event of a war with Japan, Therefore, they compiled lists for the preventive detention of those who would be arrested in case war broke out. These lists allowed the government to begin arresting those who were now labeled enemy aliens shortly after the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor.
We interrupt this program to bring you a special news bulletin. The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii by air, President Roosevelt has just announced.
The response to the attack on the American naval base was a racist and xenophobic hysteria. For the most part, the detainees were community leaders, male members of immigrant groups whom the government considered suspicious, leaders of a Japanese Yasoshichen, or priests, in Buddhist temples, for example, were detained because of their race and occupation, rather than anything they had specifically done. This was mirrored in the population, as later recounted by a discriminated citizen.
Then when I went back to school that following morning, December 8th, one of the teachers said, "You people bombed Pearl Harbor." And I'm going, "My people?" All of a sudden, my Japanese-ness became very aware to me, And then that I no longer felt I'm an equal American, that I felt kind of threatened and nervous about it.
The leaders of the Japanese community, initially held in local facilities along with some prisoners of German and Italian descent, were later transferred to internment camps managed by the military or the Immigration and Naturalization Service. In addition to the rapid arrest and detention of those previously identified as suspects, stronger measures soon came from the political leaders of the West Coast, who relied on 5 decades of anti-Japanese sentiment. On February 19, 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9266, granting the military the power to exclude anyone it deemed fit under the pretext of military necessity. Initially, Japanese Americans were encouraged to move inland on their own, what the government called voluntary evacuation. However, leaders from other Western states opposed this, as they did not want Japanese people on their land, and this plan was canceled when only a small percentage of Japanese Americans had relocated. Instead, the War Relocation Authority, WRA, quickly established 15 assembly centers and 2 reception centers to accommodate Japanese Americans. These locations used existing facilities, such as fairgrounds and abandoned horse racing tracks, near the areas from which the Japanese community was being expelled. Residents were given a week to settle their affairs and report for their own exile. There are numerous sad stories of speculators offering Japanese individuals in distress a few cents for their possessions, or taking over farms full of ready-to-harvest crops. Many prisoners ended up living in recently vacated horse stables and slept on straw mattresses, previously used by the animals. Living conditions were truly unsanitary and degrading, as recounted by the following testimony.
They had a hell of a lot of nerve calling it Camp Harmony. But anyway, it was, it was a real traumatic type of living, where you're in the former stalls where the pigs and the cows and everything else were. Families of 6 and 7 were crowded into one little spot.
After stays ranging from a few weeks to several months, Japanese Americans were transferred to 10 concentration camps run by a newly created federal agency, the War Relocation Authority, WRA. Located in desolate deserts or swamps, these relocation centers were surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers and were still under construction when the first prisoners arrived. The testimony of this prisoner illustrates the distressing moment.
I stayed until the last person got into the compound and heard the gate clang behind me. And I think when people ask what my memory was about evacuation, I think I'll always remember the sound of the gate clanging. Yeah, I knew.
The inmates lived in barrack blocks with communal bathrooms, laundries, and dining halls. Many complained about the extreme weather, dust storms, lack of privacy, and inadequate food among the many difficulties of living behind barbed wire. Housing was very basic, and the more luxurious spaces were those with a light bulb. Families were crowded into small rooms with up to 10 people in a minimal space. The lack of privacy, hygiene, and freedom severely affected the inhabitants of the camps, who lived under constant fear, as told by one of the prisoners.
We lived in mortal fear. We laid out our plans should they come and attack and we had nobody to help protect us. We would run in a certain direction through the cattle field, which was nearby, and we would hide behind these old wooden fences that were, from my bird's eye view, was about 8 to 10 feet high, you know. And we knew where we were all going to hide and try to defend ourselves.
The WRA tried to manage the camps as if they were small towns, establishing schools and recreational activities, and even holding elections for a kind of self-government. The inmates took on much of the work to keep the camps running, from preparing and serving food in the mess halls to cutting down trees for firewood, all for a meager $12 or at most $19 per month. The prisoners worked very hard to beautify their arid surroundings, planting gardens and crafting a wide variety of furniture and decorative items for their units. But at the same time, the reality of imprisonment did not escape anyone. They felt like animals in a zoo designed to make them believe they were free, but they were truly a captive race, an overwhelming feeling conveyed in the following testimony.
Shoulders. I went up to the fence and I heard a rustling in the grass. I really was kind of wistful for what was outside the fence and thinking, you know, I used to be able to do that. Then there was a snake that was rustling around in the grass. I saw it and I put my foot out like this, and it must have frightened him because it wiggled right underneath the fence. And I thought, oh, that garter snake has a lot more freedom than I have. It can go under the fence and go away, and I can't do that.
But how did Americans manage to make these living conditions of the Japanese community go unnoticed and remain in the dark for so long? The answer lies in a systematic propaganda plan. Initially, the US government hired the famous photographer Dorothea Lange to take photographs while 110,000 Japanese Americans were removed from their homes on the West Coast and interned in remote military-style camps throughout the interior. The idea was to present a positive image of this process, however twisted it may sound. The problem was that Lange did not do what the American authorities expected. She believed that internment was a grave injustice, and her photographs show it. She captured the confusing and chaotic scenes of Japanese Americans crowded on buses and trains, the stressed and confused looks on their faces, their closed businesses, and the dilapidated barracks that would become their homes for months or years. The agency hoped that the photos would depict the process as orderly and humane, but the hundreds of photos that Lange delivered did just the opposite, as recounted by her biographer in this interview.
She was living in California, and she was already a government photographer. That made her the logical person to do it. But after she did this job, which she did in 1942, when the U.S. Army major in charge of this whole operation saw the photographs, they were so unmistakably critical that he impounded them for the duration of the war and put them in some private plane.
For that reason, the U.S. government had to resort to a Plan B. The director of one of the camps hired his photographer friend, Ansel Adams, to take photos that would feed the American narrative about the orderly camps and the good living conditions of the Japanese. In fact, the place that seems arid and depressing in Lange's photos looks beautiful in Adams' photos. It doesn't even seem like a detention center, partly because Adams, like other photographers, was not allowed to photograph the watchtowers or barbed wire. This photo, however, was taken literally from a watchtower. There are scenes of a volleyball game, children walking to school, a gathering outside a chapel. There are also many smiles. In Adams' vision, the camps appear as a place where Japanese Americans, dignified, resilient, and optimistic despite their circumstances, built a temporary community in the desert. However, the reality in the camps was very different from what Adams's photographs showed, sometimes even being contentious. After several riots in the camps in the fall of 1942, the WRA devised a strategy to give false relief to the prisoners. It was then that it instituted a morally dubious questionnaire in early 1943 in an effort to separate loyal Japanese Americans from disloyal ones, based on the answers to two key questions, which consisted of pledging loyalty to a country that segregated them and swearing not to be traitors who would harm the United States in the war with Japan. The fate of the prisoners was decided. The loyal ones were considered eligible to enlist in the army or leave the concentration camps and resettle in areas away from the West Coast, while the disloyal ones were segregated in the Tule Lake concentration camp in California. When eligibility for military service was reinstated for Japanese Americans in early 1943, surprisingly, thousands of Japanese Americans signed up to serve in Uncle Sam's ranks. Most became members of the segregated 412nd Regimental Combat Team, which fought in some of the toughest battles on the European front and became one of the most decorated units of the war, even recognized in period video materials.
For a brilliant fighting record from Salerno onward, the Japanese Americans are cited as a unit and receive citation streamers to be permanently attached to their battle colors.
While American propaganda portrayed them as heroes, it was clear that, considering them second-class and disposable citizens, this unit was used for the most dangerous missions in which many Japanese soldiers lost their lives. Other luckier Japanese Americans joined intelligence units in the Pacific as Japanese language specialists, whose interrogation and translation skills greatly contributed to Allied successes. Although a racist security apparatus forced them to overcome many obstacles, many Japanese Americans, mostly young people, managed to leave the concentration camps in 1943 and 1944 with the support of the WRA. Forbidden to return to the West Coast, most headed east to try to lead a normal life and seek jobs and better opportunities in cities like Chicago, Denver, and New York. The WRA and President Roosevelt believed that dispersing Japanese Americans across the country would prevent the formation of ethnic communities that could be deemed dangerous and tangentially reduce prejudice against them. Approximately 1/3 of those considered loyal left the concentration camps by the end of 1944, but they were not allowed to return to the West Coast until 1945. Those who returned were often greeted rudely and segregationally by locals who opposed their return, with truly despicable discriminatory demonstrations, as we can see below. The little Tokyo's from before the war no longer existed, and the same happened in rural areas where many Japanese Americans had lost their farms. Both city dwellers and countryside residents of Japanese descent had to start from scratch because they had been segregated by a country that racially discriminated against them. With the end of the war, Japanese Americans slowly rebuilt their communities but faced continued racism and difficulties. However, in parallel, the image of Japanese Americans changed drastically in the years following World War II. Many Americans gradually recognized that wartime internment had been a mistake. At the same time, Japanese soldiers who fought for the United States and its allies cited the heroism of the Nisei troops in their calls for fair treatment and the repeal of racist laws. Japanese Americans were even proclaimed a model minority. Despite this discursive vindication, the traumas left by the unjust internment of the Japanese community were unknown. The younger Nisei, inspired by the social movements of the 1960s, began to press for a true reconsideration of their wartime experiences and eventually for reparations for their internment. Much of this call for justice and the courage to confront what happened had to do with the dissemination of Lange's sincere and powerful photos. Finally, in 1988, the Civil Liberties Act was passed, providing $20,000 payments to surviving former detainees and a live-streamed presidential apology to the entire nation.
We gather here today to right a grave wrong. More than 40 years ago, shortly after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, 120,000 persons of Japanese ancestry living in the United States were forcibly removed from their homes and placed in makeshift internment camps. This action was taken without trial, without jury. It was based solely on race, for these 120,000 were Americans of Japanese descent. The legislation that I am about to sign provides for a restitution payment to each of the 60,000 survivors. Yet no payment can make up for those lost years.
In the post-reparation period, Japanese Americans have tried to publicize their wartime experiences to prevent such racial and discriminatory abuses by the government from happening again, whether to them or to other ethnic groups or minorities. And that brings us to the end of the video today. Leave your opinions in the comments below. We thank you for sticking with us until the end and look forward to the next installments of Military History.